Hey guys, before we get into today's video, I just wanted to let you know that over 90% of you aren't subscribed. If you would please take the time and hit that subscribe button, it means a lot to me, and thank you very much. We'll get into it now. I will stamp on the ground with my foot and shake down every house. Thus spoke the great Native American chief Tecumseh, predicting, some believed, the series of violent earthquakes that struck the Midwest in the winter of 1811 to 1812. So, did Tecumseh predict the New Madrid earthquake? Find out. The town of New Madrid in southeastern Missouri looks out over a treacherous stretch of the Mississippi River, studded with bars and laced with stumpy shores, a graveyard of rivercraft, and haunted. Some ghosts are dead dreams. George Morgan, the town's founder, planted his colony there in 1789, with permission from the Spanish authorities. He picked a site surpassing natural beauty, on high ground commanding a view of the river 6 miles above and 10 miles below stream. In the crook of a horseshoe bend, 25 miles in length, and 70 miles below the point where the Mississippi River joined the Ohio River. A land spectacular, Revolutionary War veteran, and dabbler in scientific architecture. Morgan also had been a visionary. His plan for the city was not to be exceeded in size and in manner by cities around the world. It was to extend 4 miles south, 2 west from the river, so as to also include St. Annis and its limits, on whose banks were to be wide streets and roads planted with trees for the health of the citizens. A street 120 feet wide on the bank of the river was also to be planted with trees. 12 acres in the middle of the city was to be likewise ornamented or preserved for public walks, 40 half-acre lots for other public uses, and 1 lot of 12 acres for the king's use. Morgan fell out with the Spanish authorities as soon as he returned to New Jersey to resume his interrupted investigations of the Hessian fly. Many of the original Virginia and Carolina colonists sickened and died. Nevertheless, a town grew up around the streets and the marketplace they laid out. The Spanish built a fort and levied duties on river traffic, to vast disgust of the American boatmen. In 1804, when the town passed into American hands, it became the administrative center of one of 5 districts which the Upper Territory was organized. The seat of the territorial court, Travelers, a 19th century historian wrote, found it a cheerful-looking town. It stood on a high bank in a broad bend of the river. Many of the houses were painted white with wide verandas or piazzas, and coming as they did from a wilderness region, where no town had greeted their eyes since leaving the Falls of Ohio. The first view of this smiling village was animated and delightful. The inhabitants were a mix of Spanish, French, and American. The site was considered to be very judicious for one town, at a time of this voyage, being 1805, that contained a population of 300 or 400 inhabitants, amongst who there were a number of genteel families noted for their hospitality. If New Madrid was hardly the metropolis of Morgan's vision, it required no extravagant act of the imagination to predict a brilliant future for the town. Mighty cities had begun less auspiciously, but it was not to be done. A dozen years after Louisiana passed into American hands, the paraphetic botanist Thomas Nuttall found only an insignificant French hamlet, once cheerful site, containing little more than about 20 log houses and stores miserably supplied, when the English geologist Sir Charles Lyell stopped over with his wife in 1846. New Madrid was a squalid settlement with no inn. He was obliged to spend the night with a baker who took in lodgers. Gone was the commanding height with the long view of the river. The site of the town had sunk to a flat plain. Morgan's streets and marketplace had long since been claimed by the river. On Monday morning last, this being December 16th, 1811, about 2:15, the St. Louis, Louisiana Gazette reported St. Louis and the surrounded country was visited by one of the most violent shocks of earthquakes that had ever been recorded in the discovery of the country. This was not sensational journalism. 2 major shocks occurred. On January 23rd and February 7th, 1812. Each of 3 modern seismologists believe was equal to any that have occurred in the nation, including the San Francisco and Anchorage quakes. They were followed by secondary shocks, only less violent and usually more devastating. In between and for months thereafter, the earth trembled like a bowl of gelatin, and for years periodic tremors were felt throughout a vast area of the Mississippi Valley. The center was slightly west and just to the south of New Madrid. The large shocks were felt at great distances, from Canada in the north to New Orleans in the south, and all along the eastern seaboard, sometimes with alarming effect. The first shock of December 16th hit South Carolina sometime around 3 in the morning. In Charleston, the church bells rang maniacally, as if to give fire alarm. Clocks stopped, and houses were so much moved, an observer noted, with commendable gravity, that many persons were induced to rise from their beds. 7 shocks were reported in Charleston during the month of December, as many as 8 during the same period in Detroit, far to the north. At Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Louisville, and St. Louis, there were varying reports of stone and brick houses cracked, chimneys, gables, and parapets toppled, and at Cape Girardeau, south of St. Louis, collapsed houses. Jared Brooks at Louisville and Dr. Daniel Drake at Cincinnati kept the only known systematic observations over the whole period of the disturbances. Between December 16, 1811, and March 15, 1812, Brooks counted 1,874 shocks, 8 of which he classed to be violent, 10 very severe, 35 as moderate, and the rest ranging between generally bearable and perceptible. Yet there were no fatalities in the vicinity of St. Louis or along the Ohio, and a few injuries, nausea, dizziness, however, were common. The constant trembling of the ground for a few weeks at a time, like the flesh of beef just killed, seemed to affect the balance of perception and reality. Brooks reported in March that sound seems to have lost its rotundity. As a matter, sonorous properties, the peal of the bell, the beat of the drum, the crowing of the cock, the human call, although near at hand, seemed to be at the distance. The different reports seemed to steal, in a matter silently and separately, and distinctly upon the ear, breaking upon, or being lost, or confused by each other. The area most affected was relatively small, some 30 to 50,000 square miles, nevertheless included land in 5 states: Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Missouri. The zone followed the line of the river from Cairo to Memphis, and width extended from a high point west of the river, called Crowley Ridge, to the Chickasaw Bluffs on the east side. Within this area, the effects were truly spectacular and wrought permanent changes on the landscape. Some parts were uplifted, while others sank, and the ground yawned in frightening fissures. Ponds and swamps appeared, and lakes, including 18-mile-long Lake Reelfoot in Tennessee, were created. During the hard shocks and the sudden darkness caused by thick sulfurous vapor, the smell of brimstone, deafening explosions, and water and sand and organic matter vomited to the great heights lasted for several minutes at a time. Eyewitnesses' account graphically captured abject terror, to which human beings and animals were reduced. One surveyor wrote, "It rushed out in all quarters, bringing with it carbonized wood, reduced to dust, which was ejected to the height of 10 to 15 feet, and fell in a black shower, mixed with the sand and rapid motion had forced along. At the same time, the roaring and whistling produced by the impetuosity of the air escaping from its confinement, seeming to increase the horrible disorder of the trees, which everywhere encountered each other, being blown up, crackling and splitting, and falling by the thousands at a time. In the meantime, the surface was sinking, and a black liquid was rising up to the belly of my horse, who stood motionless, struck with a panic of terror." Nothing was so unsettling as the sight of those trees suddenly reduced to matchsticks. Eliza Bryan at New Madrid told of seeing whole groves of young cottonwood trees broken off with such regularity that persons who had not witnessed this fact would with difficulty be persuaded that it had not been a work of art. A boatman on the river 13 miles below or to the south of New Madrid on February 7th saw whole force on each bank fall prostrate, like soldiers grounding their arms at the word of command. Among the settlers, only 2 deaths were reported on land throughout the entire period of the disturbances. Both were women at New Madrid. One was said to have died of fright during the first shock, the other of injuries. according to one report of the French population of New Madrid, were engaged in dancing and frolicking when the first shock came on, whereupon they fled outdoors. From Pittsburgh to Natchez, all accounts believe that the instinctive first response was to rush outside, usually without too much concern about clothing. This no doubt saved many lives, especially in New Madrid, in neighboring settlement of Little Prairie, where houses collapsed. The characteristic wooden dwellings eliminated the hazard of falling masonry, which killed 10,000 in an earthquake no more severe at Caracas in March 1812. Towns such as Pittsburgh, St. Louis, and Natchez, where brick and stone houses were more common, were outside the area of the severest impact. Also, all three of the major shocks were followed by periods of constant trembling when nothing could prevail upon the people to return to their dwellings. This minimized the chance of injury, since secondary shocks a few hours later caused the greatest damage to weakened structures. The upheavals transformed the peaceful setting of New Madrid into a hell. One inhabitant, writing on secondary daylight shocks in December 16th, was at a loss for an accurate description. The houses shook very much, chimneys falling in every direction, the loud, hoarse roaring which attended the earthquake together with the cities, screams and yells of the people, seemed still ringing in my ears. About the panic that prevailed there is little question. The uproar among the people, the screams and yells were heard at a great distance. Commenting the following day on who had passed his tent, the inhabitant wrote, "Some were agitated that they could not speak, others could not hold their tongue, some cannot sit still, and must be in constant motion, while others cannot walk. Several men, on the night of the first shock, deserted their families and have not been heard from since. At first, camps to 50 to 100% were set up in open fields. Although nothing could bring the people to return to them, the dwellings and other structures withstood the shocks of December. Most seem to have lasted through January. Weakened structures could not stand up to such punishment indefinitely, and the hard shocks of February 7th brought most of them down. Travelers who passed on the site at that date agreed that very little remained standing. While the site itself had sunk from 12 to 15 feet, it continued to sink, and most of the original town had become part of the riverbed. The New York Evening Post reported on March 11th that citizens had fled to the mountains. It is said that there are none in number to 1,000 in the number. Merciful God, this was close to the truth. A visitor in late February found the inhabitants moved off. A few of the French who lived in camps close to the riverside, and their boats tied near them in order to sail off, in case the earth shall sink. Boats were precious. They provided means of escape from the dissolution of the land. In desperation of one woman of New Madrid, she offered unsuccessfully to trade a likely fellow, for the use of a boat for a few hours. Nevertheless, the destruction of human life was far greater than any on the river and land. The number will never be determined, but probably ran to scores of people. In the early morning hours of December 16th, large numbers of flatboats, including small fleets, were tied up at islands or along the shores. Those that made the mistake of mooring under high banks were put in great danger from cave-ins and landslides, either being crushed directly or swamped by waves from an enormous splash. Many would perish this way. The hard shocks of the evening and early morning hours were all caught the boats at the mooring. Those during the daylight hours when the boats were adrift were no less frightening. At different times, there were reports of water rising many feet above before suddenly dropping, of accelerated currents sweeping along trees, boats, men, and debris, of islands, some of which were many acres in extent, splitting asunder or disappearing even before the river's current started to run backwards. In the midst of the frightening scenes, a steamboat, the New Orleans, appeared, built by Nicholas Roosevelt of New Jersey. It was the first paddle-wheeler to navigate western waters. Roosevelt had started down the Ohio on its maiden cruise in October, accompanied by his pregnant wife, Lydia, an engineer, a pilot, and 6 crew hands. They were detained in Louisville 3 weeks before the river to rise long enough to navigate the falls below the town. As it turned out, Lydia to be delivered her child. It was after leaving Louisville, while weighing anchor below the falls, that the New Orleans felt the first jolt of the earthquake. The effect was as though the vessel had been in motion and suddenly grounded. For 3 days they passed through the most alarming commotion. Trees blocked the way. Section of the shore collapsed into water. The pilot found the channel suddenly unfamiliar. The river began to rise. The apprehensions of the times made them doubly jittery. One night, they awakened by shouts and the trampling of feet, and Roosevelt rushed on deck with his sword to repel Native American boarders. But it turned out to be a fire on board he had to fight. Most of the time they moved through vast solitude as they picked their way gingerly along. They stood on the deck watching trees along the shoreline nod and sway despite the total absence of a breeze. One of the peculiar characteristics of the voyage, according to J.H.B. Latrobe, brother of Lydia Roosevelt, was the silence that prevailed on board. No one seemed disposed to talk, and conversation was carried on in whispers. Their dog prowled about moaning and growling, and they had come to expect a commotion of more than usual violence when it sought the lap of Lydia. Eventually the steamboat appeared off New Madrid, where terror-stricken people begged to be taken aboard. While others, dreading the steamboat even more than the earthquake, hid themselves as she approached. To receive the former was impossible. There would be refugees who had no homes to go to, and ample as was the supply of provisions. It would have been altogether insignificant for a large increase of passengers. Painful as it was, there was no choice but to turn a deaf ear to those cries of the terrified inhabitants of the doomed town. When the little crew materialized at Natchez, their arrival was greeted as providential. They had been given up as lost. Many Native Americans of the region welcomed the dread visitor. The sun had almost set for the Native American peoples of the Northwest Territory. They had struggled valiantly, but their bravest warriors were slain, once mighty chiefs were no longer militant, and the future offered bleak choice between the extermination and removal beyond the Mississippi. A brooding misery settled in upon the tribes in the years before the earthquakes, and many among them found hope in the cause of Tecumseh and his brother, Tenskwata. The prophet Tenskwata preached Jeremiah of religious regeneration and attracted a growing number of followers. They were also recruits of Tecumseh, a Shawnee chief, the equal in nobility and native endowment to the greatest statesman of the age, who ranged over astonishing distances across the Northwest, preaching a message with all the force and eloquence at his command. Only national and cultural unity among the tribes could prevent further white encroachments. In the fall of 1811, with the support of British Canada, and with the approach of the war between the United States and Great Britain, Tecumseh carried his message to the south, among the Choctaws, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminoles, and Cherokee. He had indifferent success, although a faction of the Creek, named the Red Sticks, Tecumseh had distributed among them, did eventually take the warpath. One legend has it that a half-breed Creek chief named Weatherford finally convinced Tecumseh accurately to forecast the New Madrid earthquakes. James Mooney, in his book Ghost Dance Religion, recounts the story of Tecumseh's prediction, made in a speech to the Creek at the town of Tucabachi on the Tallapoosa River, near present site of Montgomery, Alabama. "Your blood is white. You taken my talk, and sticks, and the wampum, and the hatchet, but you do not mean to light. I know the reason. You do not believe the Great Spirit has sent me. You shall know. I leave Tucabachi directly, shall go straight to Detroit. When I arrive there, I will stomp on the ground with my foot and shake down every house in Tucabachi." So saying, he left the big warrior in utter amazement at both his manner and threat, and pursued his journey. The Native Americans were struck no less with his conduct than was the big warrior, and began to dread the arrival of the day with the threatened calamity would befall them. They met often and talked over this matter, and counted the days carefully to know the day when Tecumseh would reach Detroit. The morning they had fixed upon as the day of the arrival had at last come. A mighty rumbling was heard, and the Native Americans all ran out of their houses. The earth began to shake, when at last, sure enough, every house in Tucabachi was shaken down. The exclamation was in every mouth, "Tecumseh has got to be in Detroit." The effect was electric. The message was delivered to the big warrior. was believed, and many of the Native Americans took their rifles and prepared for war. It was the famous earthquake of New Madrid on the Mississippi. While Tecumseh was away, William Henry Harrison marched with an army against the chief principal's base at the Prophet's Town. The Battle of Tippecanoe in November was a standoff, with enormous losses on both sides, but the slain Native American warriors were irreplaceable. Tecumseh continued on his travels, unaware that his military power had already broken. Harrison claimed victory, but the ignorance of the whereabouts of Tecumseh and the battle's inconclusive character left the border jittery. These events mingled strangely with the earthquakes. After the shocks of December, the inhabitants of New Madrid were told by a Native American in the vicinity that the prophet had caused the earthquake to destroy the whites. Even without such reminders, for some whites, the onslaught of the first shock brought immediate thought of Native American menace and the fear of retribution. Tecumseh certainly recognized the potential usefulness of the earthquakes for his purposes. The white captive, John Dunn Hunter, recalled a speech as he moved among the Osage on his return trip from the South, early in 1812, still ignorant of Tippecanoe. "Brothers, the Great Spirit is angry with our enemies. He speaks in thunder, and the earth swallows up villages, and drinks up the Mississippi. The great waters will cover their lowlands. Their corn cannot grow. The Great Spirit will sweep those who escape the hills from this earth with his terrible breath." So, with that being said, and the notion of Tecumseh taking credit for the New Madrid shocks and earthquake, did he actually somehow manage to cause these? Well, there is some circumstantial evidence and hearsay with personal stories and so on. The answer would definitely be a no, as cool as it would be if he had. Fortunately, there is no man-made earthquake technology at the time of 1811, 1812, or else the world would be a lot different place with much more destruction. But thank you very much. Please leave a like and subscribe. This is Ruin Maniac John signing off.